As some of you came in, I did have one of those moments where I suddenly felt really, really old, genuinely. And in my head, I'm still 25. But sadly, I appreciate I'm not. But actually, in preparing for tonight, it struck me about 15 years ago. I was kind of starting out on my HR career. I didn't, to make many of you probably leave education and think, I want to work in HR. But I did want to work in policing, interestingly. I come from 3 generations of cops in my family, so this was always the place that I was going to go and work. But HR was something I kind of fell into. But on one of the CIPD workshops that I expect many of you went to 15 years ago, I remember sitting in front of the presentation, and it was about the role of HR. And one of the kind of speakers talked about what draws us to a career in HR. Now, the Ulrich model was the fashion of the day, which is kind of ironic because he is now releasing kind of latest thinking in the role of HR. But the speaker asked us, what drew you to career in HR? And a lot of people responded, I want to help people. I want to support people. And that speaker basically said to us, you're in the wrong profession. HR is not about helping people. It is not about supporting people. It's about knowing your business, driving performance in the business, and getting the best from, I hate this phrase, your people asset. And I sat there and thought, that's great, because I'm so in the right place, because actually this is what I was about. It struck me that actually nowadays for HR to maintain a seat at the table, we do need to understand the business. And I talk a lot about the fact that you work in HR, but you know what? We are running businesses and organisations. And I worked my entire career in the public sector. But let's be really clear, we have a bottom line. It's not profit, but we do have a bottom line. Our work is only successful when we can maintain the trust and confidence of the communities in London and where they are satisfied in the policing that we deliver. And actually, what I'm going to talk about tonight goes to the heart of how effective our policing services are in getting our community to engage with us. But let's just keep you back a little bit, if I may. So when I was starting out in my profession, policing, like the whole of the public sector, was in rapid growth. Many of our leaders didn't have to work in an organisation where we were having to make decisions about the bottom line. And what followed, like many others, is quite substantial cuts in the public sector. So my HR career has very much been shaped in terms of actually how do you reduce cost, how do you drive out efficiency, how do you become more effective, how do you move from the transactional into the transformational, how do you encourage employees and managers to take more responsibility for people management, how do you drive towards self-service. Many of the managers in the Met, and this is not unique to us, still hanker after the days when they had an HR professional sitting alongside them doing people management stuff for you. And as much as I'd like to say that in the 4 years that I've worked for the Met, we've achieved that transformation, we haven't yet. So the Met's HR journey is no different. We have taken about 30% cost out of our HR baseline. We've moved from a devolved HR structure into small centres of expertise, strategic business partnering, and we have outsourced all of our HR operations, including occupational health. I now have a team of about 100 HR professionals that work for the Met. The rest is done in commercial organisations, and it works pretty well. One of the challenges for me when I came into the Met is HR was seen as transactional. There's low trust, low confidence in us. And actually, we worked extremely hard, and some of the people with me today should take the credit for that, not me, in developing quite a high trust, high value service in the organisation. We've worked really, really hard to develop a great reputation in our organisation. We've got just under 50,000 people, 10,000 line managers. That's really hard to do. We are very, very clear as an HR leadership team about our HR reputation, and we're really clear on what we want to deliver as part of our legacy. But we do, as I said, still struggle with that ongoing debate about what's the role of HR, what's the role of a line manager. We have robustly held the line in terms of what we do and what we expect others to do. And we have never, ever stepped over that line. Now, on Wednesday, the 22nd of March, 2017, a terrorist attack took place in Westminster. Now behind me, if you can see the screen, you're going to see some of the images from that day. They're things you would have seen in the press and the media. Some of them are a little bit upsetting, but I think it brings to life for you what our people deal with every single day. So interestingly, I don't know if you've seen, but New Scotland Yard has moved. We are now on Victoria Embankment. We are hundreds of feet from Westminster Bridge. And on that afternoon, we were sat up on the 6th floor and we saw what was happening on Westminster Bridge. We didn't know what was going on at the time, but just imagine, if you will, a very, very fast response to that attack. And our news feed literally was coming from BBC News. So in our offices, we've got TV screens up. We very, very quickly realised what was happening. We didn't know the extent to what was happening. We didn't know whether there were going to be further attacks in London. But in the space of no more than an hour, we had to take some decisions about what the role of HR was going to be in response to a terrorist attack in London. We knew well before the media knew that we had tragically lost one of our colleagues. Keith Palmer had been killed in the Palace of Westminster. We knew that not only we were dealing with the fact that a lot of our officers and staff were going to face really traumatic situations, but they had lost one of their own. Now, it's really interesting because talking to some of my colleagues who have used to work for the military, the psychological contract with police officers is that they put themselves in harm's way. They run towards danger when all of the rest of us step back. But let's be really clear. Fortunately, very few of our police officers are actually killed on duty. When this happens, it's really, really hard for our people. They feel incredibly vulnerable, and their friends and family feel incredibly vulnerable too. So our challenge was actually, how do we respond to this? Do we hold the line in terms of the role of line managers, the role of HR, or do we step in to different space? I genuinely knew from some of the work we'd done, and I'll talk about that in a minute, that what we did in those first few hours would make or break the reputation in our organisation of HR, and more importantly, it would make or break how much trust our officers and staff had in the Met in terms of an employer. Now, before I talk about what we did, and then you can start to think about how relevant that would be in your context, let me talk a little bit about policing. Following the Paris attacks in 2015, the police service nationally really stepped up, recognising that threats were changing. We had an increase in funding from government. We were putting more resources into firearms, into detectives who could investigate and prevent terrorist crime. We have exceptional people that work in our organisation, and they work relentlessly to stop the attacks that happen in Westminster happening. And you know what? Most of the time they do prevent that type of crime. We are an emergency service, and we do plan, train and practice our response to these type of events, and that includes HR. When our operational colleagues are practicing their response to the type of attack that you saw in Westminster, we are absolutely alongside them, thinking about what we would do in that scenario. During 2016, so last year, I was really concerned about the role of HR. I was concerned about whether or not our occupational health service, which in policing is quite significant, would be able to step up to this sort of attack. So again, we practiced, we rehearsed, we did different tabletop exercises. We did the best we could to be ready, and we hoped we would never ever have to respond to such an attack. So, what were the things that we did? Now, I've just got 4 things I'm going to talk very, very quickly about, and then we'll open up to questions. Before I do that, I'm conscious that what I'm talking about feels quite unique to emergency services, but just think over the weekend about British Airways. Think about how it might feel to be an employee of BA. Think how it feels to be a member of HR in BA. It doesn't matter what the crisis is, but actually, how do you hold that reputation dear? So, 4 things we did. We thought about who does what best. So in a crisis, you want your people focused on the things that they do best. Now, for our operational leaders, we needed them managing the response to that terrorist attack. We needed them in a command and control mode. Now, think about that left and right hand side of the brain for leaders. It's really, really hard to be directional, to be in charge, to be command and control, to think about that response at the same time as thinking about, are my people okay? How do I handle a conversation? It's really directional and fast paced. Then quickly switch into the mode about saying, actually, how are you doing? Are you okay? Demobilizing and diffusing the situations that they'd seen. We knew from our exercising plans that getting that response right in those first few hours were the things that were going to prevent long-term damage to our people. So we ran for that space. All bets were kind of off for us. The role of HR in that moment, flick us back 15 years, was absolutely about managing the welfare of our people. It was supporting line managers to do the things that they didn't have the capacity to do. And it was making sure we held them in a state where they felt confident, they trusted us, and they felt engaged. In the space of a few hours, we deployed occupational health staff to locations across London. We got counsellors out to people. We had bereavement support in place. And the sheer physical presence of actually a very small number of HR and occupational health professionals really did make a fundamental difference. The other thing that we did really, really well was control the narrative. Don't worry. So we knew that our people were anxious. We have such a large group of staff, so many line managers, and on our scale, how do you touch and feel all the people across the organisation? We relentlessly pursued every single communications channel available to us. Within hours, I was on a conference call with senior police leaders talking to the whole of our organisation. What was so important was giving them some reassurance, telling them what we would do, what was normal, and actually, most importantly, what they were not going to see to start with. And you know, it was just about that marketing. It was managing the kind of public relations there internally. But we literally had a window of more than 3 or 4 hours to get that right. And candidly, there were times when I didn't know whether or not we were going to be able to respond and whether or not the service in HR was going to stack up to what they needed. But you know what? You don't blink. People need to hear that they're going to be okay. They need to hear that the organisation is putting them first at a time when we are asking them to do very, very difficult and challenging things. That reassurance message, every few hours over the next few days, we were there. And I cannot tell you strongly enough, don't underestimate the impact of your internal communications, your engagement with people, and that regular updating. I spoke just by coincidence this evening to colleagues in Manchester who we gave some support to last week. And their reflections as well is that for their officers, the exposure to trauma was significant, so much so that some of them didn't even recognise that they'd actually received some really great support in the first few hours. So when you're in crisis, telling your people something once is just not enough. You have to keep going, telling them again and again. You have to change the message. You've got to give them data. You need to show them that you're gripping the challenge ahead of them. The other thing for me is, as an HR profession, we talk a lot about business partnering. Now, my own view is in most of the profession, all we did was relabel HR managers, personnel managers, call them business partners, not do much else transformation. But on that day, well, the most important thing we had was the test of whether or not we were trusted, whether we had great partnerships in the organisation. I talked earlier about the fact that HR need a credible voice at the board table. Let me tell you, if you haven't got the voice, in a time of crisis, you're not going to get the voice. And what I learnt is actually, I kind of knew this already, the most amazing business partnering team. They had great relationships with their leaders. They knew how to get into our organisation. And when they said they were going to do something, they would. There was absolutely no question that HR would have a seat at the table and would be viewed as really valuable and effective alongside our operational colleagues. If we had not earned that trust and respect and had that credibility, we would not have been successful in doing what we were going to do. And lastly, don't underestimate the small things. Again, my reflections are there are things that you do, and really candidly, I didn't know they were going to have this impact. but really think about the small things. So our response, I've talked about our communications, I've talked about giving some really reassuring messages. And you know what, in policing, it can be quite a macho organisation. We don't like to talk about our feelings. We're all about the evidence, we're all about the thinking. But one of the things we had to do over those first few days was tell our people it was okay to say you're not okay. And actually getting that support out to people, even if they didn't want to use it, and breaking down some of those barriers was really important. Keith Palmer worked at the Palace of Westminster. He'd not been there that long, and preceding that he was with a team in our tactical support group. The Met's so big, not every officer or member of staff would have known Keith. But actually the vulnerability for officers and staff was that could have been them. Because actually Keith would have gone to work that morning just expecting to do his job. And I think don't underestimate when you're in crisis the impact that has for everybody in the organisation. Those bereavement counsellors that went out to the teams that Keith had previously worked for led to one of Keith's team being able to stand outside New Scotland Yard less than 24 hours after Keith's death to lay some flowers. But it was in front of the media. You know, for at least a week afterwards, you could not walk out of New Scotland Yard without the media being present. And one of the pictures behind me that you'll see is that team stood outside New Scotland Yard. And I had the most amazing text from their commander. And he texted me a photo of the team and just said simply, "We could not have done this without your people." I thought nothing about getting bereavement counsellors out to that team. But they felt strong enough to stand outside and show their support for Keith and his family. Keith had a full police funeral, which you again may have seen in the media at Southwark. It's unusual for us to do that type of funeral. We had officers actually travel from across the world to be at Southwark, and officers from all over the country lined the route. Now by then, the kind of initial response had died down. We'd done our demobilising, we'd done our diffusing, we had debriefed officers, we got really great trauma support into those that had needed it. So actually, we were kind of stepping back into business as usual. I cannot take the credit for this, but that same leader whose team had managed to stand outside New Scotland Yard said, "You know what, those bereavement counsellors were fantastic. Why don't we get them out to Southwark?" Now, actually, what we had, because we had officers from all over the country, we had a conference centre. And those officers went to that conference centre very simply to get into their uniform and to get some refreshments. We just placed a couple of bereavement counsellors in that room. They did very little, didn't actually have to do any counselling. They just talked to people, they told them who they were. The impact of that was unbelievable. Officers from all around the country saw what the Met were doing. They saw the level of support that was available to them. And that small act of just deploying some of your people into a situation where they can be seen and can be visible fundamentally had an impact on the level of engagement across the service. And candidly, policing's an interesting culture. We like to be cynical. We like to have a moan. It's rare that you get good feedback. But through the process of the organisational debriefs that we do post any type of event like this, it got fed back to me that officers, both in London but across the country, recognise the impact of having those counsellors in that room at that time. And for them, that had a significant effect on their confidence to go out and do the stuff that we ask them to do every single day. So looking back, I think there's the reflection about sometimes when your people need support, that's just not the time to think about the role of HR in the way we do every single day. You find the space, you know your people are capable, you plan for it, and you run into that space and you do something truly amazing. And interestingly for us, coming out of that event, our credibility has hit an even higher level. There is so much more confidence in us as an HR service. We can have a different type of conversation again with the organisation. And candidly, we were already trading on a lot of credit in the bank, but it has gone up even more. Because when the chips are down, when your organisation is in crisis, if you can flex and you can deliver a different service, it makes the stuff you do every single day in HR so much simpler to do. So I guess the question for me was, we were as ready as we can be. How ready are you to respond to your organisation in crisis? So that's it from me.